Okay, so someone sent me MrSpherical, which looks like a fantastic YouTube channel that does these animated, fun videos explaining, I guess, things about history. And here it is asking, who started Israel v. Palestine? And the animation's really fun and clever, and it helps people understand things. But they said someone suggested that I should review this because there are some, when they say like the whole truth and nothing but the truth? Well, when you talk about the whole truth, certain things are kind of missing out of this story. Pretty crucial things, I think, that should be mentioned. And by the way, I'm not saying this as an attack. Maybe I'm sure it was meant in, there was goodwill probably in trying to understand what's going on here. But the whole truth, not quite. And nothing but the truth, well, there were some things that are, let's say, misleading at the very least. So I felt simply in the interests of educating and explaining, I would go through some of the points here. Let's watch.
Well, finally done with that whole world war thing. Again, anything left to do? Country borders, etc. I colonized Palestine after the last World War, and it sucks. Sucks how? I thought you loved colonizing. Everyone's fighting each other. They all want their own country.
Okay, now let's pause for a sec. When he said, I colonized Palestine, yeah, it's true. When he calls it Palestine, if one didn't have much knowledge, they'd think, oh, they colonized a land and group of people who were Palestinians and people that lived in this land called Palestine. Let's be clear. The land Palestine was simply a region. There was never this entity called Palestine. It was a description of a particular part of the region. And it didn't have, let's say, any particular unique identity. There were Jews living there. There are Arabs living there. Arabs consider themselves part of the Arab world, coming from the Arabian Peninsula originally. But the term Palestine actually was created by the Roman Emperor Hadrian, and he renamed the land. The land was called Judea because there had been Jews living there, right? This is 700 years before you had any Arabs living in this territory. And Arabs were another group of people that actually colonized the land. So we talk about the British colonizing it. The Arabs colonized the land in the 7th century in the Islamic conquest. But before that, before it was renamed Palestine, it was lived in by the Jews, the Jewish people, who are the indigenous inhabitants. They had a sovereign state there 2,000 years ago. The Romans, who were white European colonialists, they came to the land. They renamed Judea Palestine in order to sever the Jewish connection in reference to the Philistines, who were an ancient, extinct enemy of the Jews who came from Greece. So important to know that fact at the start. I think it's really important, because otherwise you're left with this impression that, the Jews don't really belong there, and that it's just these Palestinians, right? Which we'll see is actually a cynical, made-up term that the Arabs created themselves to describe themselves, to create this sense of them being the indigenous people. But anyway, let's continue.
Yes, I see. That's your fault, UK. You did promise both the Arab and Jewish dudes their own country. I didn't expect them to take me so seriously. Well, what do you think we should do? TBH, I low-key feel like we should help them all live together. A one-state solution. One state? No way! As many states as possible! That turned out great for me. But how do we decide who gets what? Most of the South is desert, so let's split it based on good agricultural land. And let's give the Jewish country extra space for immigration. I like it. 2 states it is. Pull the lever! No one could possibly have a problem with this. Hello?
Okay, so, by the way, it's fantastic animation. I really love it. First of all, they say, well, we promised it to them, so we didn't think they actually want it. Well, actually, the Jews were very interested in it. And they talk about this map now being this, they're going to split the map into 2. Well, in the 1930s, Britain, that was controlling this area of land, said to the Jews, this is what we propose. If you have a look here, the top, that little section in the north would be for the Jews, but the rest would be going to, maybe this is a better map here, the rest would be going to the Arabs, all that green. So the Jews would just have a tiny bit in the north. The Jews said yes, the Arabs said no. So this was before 1948, before all this. Other plans were suggested, and the Jews every time said yes. Now, let's understand the proposed map in 1947 partition plan. Okay, so they're making it sound like the Jews get slightly deceptive language of, they get more agricultural land in the south. Actually, look in blue, okay, the Jews had all that stuff in the south. That's desert. Actually, it was almost 50-50 precise split of actual, meters of land, but the Arabs were actually given more prosperous agricultural territory, and much of the land that had become agriculturally fertile had done so because the Jews who started returning to the land from the 1800s onwards started, making the land fertile through all their incredible agricultural work, draining swamps, dealing with the malaria, all that kind of stuff. And then you have this notion of, well, the Jews just came there. What are they doing there? They came out of nowhere. Obviously, they're going to be upset, the Arabs living there. First of all, there's a very small population in the land anyway, so there's plenty of space there. Secondly, there had always been a Jewish presence in the land for 4,000 years. You had the Jews who had been displaced and exiled from their sovereign territory, the only sovereign state to exist there, ever being a Jewish one 2,000 years ago and then today. But they were exiled by force by the Romans, and they were forced into Europe and the Arab world and other areas, spread all around the world. But they always maintained a Jewish presence there. There's always been a Jewish presence there. Again, as I say, long before there was the Islamic Arab conquest from the 7th century. But yes, Arabs have absolutely lived in that territory since then. So then when you're thinking, okay, well, what are we going to do with this territory now? The British are controlling it and they're handing it over to the UN. What would be fair? Well, I personally would say it's definitely fair, certainly fair, to say that the Jewish people should be able to re-establish some kind of sovereignty here, because they're the only people that ever had a sovereign state there. They have been there the longest in the territory. Yes, there's been a lot of movement to the territory from the 1800s onwards, but that's because they're trying to return back to their land. But they've always maintained a presence there. There were always Jewish people living there. Actually, part of the rise in the Arab population in this territory occurred because you had Jews coming to make the land more prosperous and more fertile. So Arabs would move there. Perfectly fine, by the way. But that's what happened. And there was no Jews coming there and just taking the land and capturing it. What happened was they purchased the land legally. You had Arabs, landowners in the land, who were perfectly willing to sell it to make some money. So it all happened legally. So I would say certainly the Jewish people, and especially as they've had a terrible time in exile, they prayed every single day to return to their land. They always say, next year in Jerusalem, next year in Jerusalem. The Torah, which they introduced to the world, which is the foundation of monotheism for the world, that believes in the God of Abraham through Christianity and Islam, it's all about the Jewish people and they're going to the promised land. If ever a people had a connection to the land, it would be the Jews. But also from an indigenous perspective, historical perspective, the fact that they've been more oppressed than any other people in exile. So from a safety perspective. But then the Arabs say, look, we have a very significant Arab population here too. We've been here for many, many centuries. So let's say, fine, okay, let's split it in two. But the video is going to, as you'll see, tries to make it out as if it's totally unfair to the Arab side.
Hello? UN Special Committee on Palestine here. Who this? Hey, UN bro. Are you about to create some more countries right on my borders? What? No, you got it all wrong, Egypt. This is going to cause trouble for everyone. Trust me. People need to decide their own destinies. What's that sound?
I gotta go, man. I'll call you later.
Rude.
Okay, so this is bizarre. Really bizarre. It's that Egypt's upset because people should be able to decide their own destinies. Well, they kind of are. The Jews are saying, we want to re-establish sovereignty. And the Arabs, well, what did they have to say? What they had to say was, the Arab leadership had to say, no Jewish state, no Jews. You had Hajj Amin al-Husseini, who was the spiritual and political leader representative of the Arabs, who was directly complicit in, well, let me just show you Hajj Amin al-Husseini. He encouraged Hitler and the Nazis to do the final solution. He went to visit the concentration camps. Here he is inspecting a Nazi army. And he wanted what the Nazis were doing in Europe to be done in what was British mandate of Palestine. Okay, here he is at visiting one of the concentration camps. So they did have their articulation of what they wanted. But what they wanted is so shocking, it's not politically correct at all, that it seems to me like they're kind of whitewashing this. They say, oh, they should have their own say. If Egypt were really concerned that the Arabs and people should have their own say, then why, between 1948 to 1967, let's get up this map, to 67 map Israel, why did you have in the south between that's the wrong map. You had Gaza, right, was controlled by Egypt. Egypt controlled that. But I thought you want them to have their own say, don't you? Because in the War of Independence, Egypt took control of Gaza, Jordan took control of the West Bank, or Judea and Samaria. There's no big call for freed Palestine, for the Arabs to be able to have sovereignty and independence then. They controlled that territory. So don't tell me that it's about them wanting to have their own say. No. Neither Egypt or actually the Arabs living there cared about it. Their issue is not who governs them, as long as it's Arabs or Muslims. Their issue is the fact that it's the Jews who are returning to their homeland and re-establishing sovereignty there. That's the issue. It's hateful. It's anti-Semitic. Because the Jewish people have every right to be there. Anyway, let's continue.
Wow! I like this plan! I declare myself a country now! What? No way! I'm not down! We've been here for centuries! This entire land is our home too! Oh yeah? Well, what are you gonna do about it? Oh! Hey! Oh!
So notice how he doesn't mention the Jews say we've been here for centuries, far longer than him. Also notice how they use this flag, the Palestinian flag. Why don't they mention that this flag, I mean, this is where it's inaccurate. They don't mention that this flag was invented in the 1960s by Arafat in order to create, he realized that the Arabs can't win a war and destroy Israel. So instead, they create this sense of free Palestine. We're actually a Palestinian people. You have to understand, had the Arabs won in 1948, God forbid, and destroyed the Jewish hopes for a homeland, this is what it would have looked like, God forbid. This would have been the map. Jordan would have a chunk, Egypt would have a chunk, Syria would have had a chunk, Lebanon would have had a chunk. There'd be no free Palestine. So you say, oh, we've been here for ages. There would have been no... And they wouldn't have complained. The proof is because between 48 to 67, they didn't complain when Jordan and Egypt controlled them. This flag was created in order to create this fake sense of actually we are a unique people with a unique identity who are indigenous to this land, all this kind of stuff. And the Jews are just these colonialists who have no right to be there. In order to create this, it's a ploy basically, a cynical ploy to try and get international support and undermine Israel. But they don't say anything about the fact that the Jews have been there far longer. And if any people have such a connection to the land, it's the Jews to this land. No mention of that. I think that's a gaping hole in this video.
Oh, this definitely won't come back to haunt us in the future.
See, the problem is there's just very little mention of the fact that the root cause of this is a hatred of the Jewish people returning to their homeland. They didn't need to be anyone displaced, any fighting, anything like that. if they simply said, no, we accept the Jewish people's right to have a homeland. The reason the displacement occurred in 48 was because the Arab armies went to war against the Jews and told Arabs, leave your homes so we can fight and throw the Jews into the sea, then you can come back. But of course that didn't happen. And now it's our fault. Even more Jews than Arabs were displaced in the War of 48. They were displaced from the Arab world, but Israel absorbed them. You don't hear about that. So the key thing that's missing is that they're making it out as if there's some kind of legitimate grievance on the Arab side. And we've realized after nearly 100 years of this conflict brewing that it's not about legitimate grievance. It's about a hateful ideology. And you want to know the reason that there is this hateful ideology? It's because it touches on such a raw nerve, the Jews returning to their homeland. If you understand Islam, certainly Islamism, the politicized version of Islam, their notion of history is that Muslims are the new chosen people of God, they have the new covenant with God, and Islam's going to overtake the world and dominate the world. Quite easy to say that when the Jews, who were, they say in the past tense, God's people to bring his voice into the world, his Torah into the world. Very easy to say that when they're dispersed, when they're exiled, it looks like God's forsaken them. But once they return to their land and they start re-establishing sovereignty and what was once controlled by an Islamic empire, that's very threatening to your narrative. It really gets to the heart of it. So you have to make an adjustment. Either you say, well, maybe God never forsook the Jews and he sticks to his word. And if he says I have an eternal covenant, then he really means it. Or this is a test from God, test from Allah, and we have to wipe out this Jewish state. That's why you have what you have. It's just far too threatening. But as we've seen, Israel and the Jewish people, no matter who comes to try and annihilate them or oppress them, the great empires and nations rise and fall, but the Jewish people continue because they reveal the hand of God in human affairs. So it's time for people to grow up and get behind that fact, because that is the way that we can truly have peace. You can't resist, ultimately, God's way of getting peace and creating the good and godly world that he so desires. Hi, thank you so much for watching. To watch another one, click here. To stay up to date with all our content, click here to subscribe. And if you're able to, you can help support JTV to grow and grow by clicking join below this video, where you can become a member and get perks including early access to videos and private live discussions with me. But most of all, you'll be partnering with us on our mission to change the world.